Today we're going to be taking a look at the Saturnite Fist, the Saturnite Fist Superheated, and the Industrial Hand. These are the other half of the Power Fists that I didn't go over when I was going over the regular Power Fist because there's so many versions of them in this game. So let's talk about each of these. These can all be found in DLCs. 2 of them are in Old World Blues, and 1 of them is in the Lonesome Road. First up, we're going to be going over the Saturnite Fist, and we're going to be talking about that. We'll also kind of go over pros and cons at the same time with these weapons, but there will be different pros and cons for each of them. So the Saturnite Fist is a fairly common weapon that you can find in Old World Blues. You can find this inside of boxes. The lobotomites can carry these around. It's also a very good unarmed weapon that you can find in Old World Blues pretty easily, which makes it kind of strange that the scientist gloves are there, and this one is substantially better than them. So this one has the same attack set as the Power Fist, although it is a bit faster at attacking than the regular Power Fist, which is pretty nice. The Saturnite Fist requires 45 unarmed and 4 strength to wield. One of those weird numbers of unarmed to use. A lot of Old World Blues stuff has this for some odd reason, I don't know why. So the unarmed and the strength isn't very high, and if you're running an unarmed character, you can probably get one of these and use it right away, even at low levels, which is pretty nice. This does 35 damage per hit, which is fairly high for an unarmed weapon like this. This does 63 damage per second, which is quite good. This has 35 crit damage, same as its regular damage, 1 times crit modifier, so normal crits. Weighs 4 weight in total, just like a regular Power Fist. Has 160 item health though, a lot more health than a regular Power Fist, which is pretty good. And this amount of item health does help it quite a bit, especially if you do want to run to Old World Blues right away. An unarmed build is actually quite strong. An unarmed build is actually quite strong in almost all of the DLCs if you want to run there. This also only costs 25 action points to use, which is pretty good. Not necessarily one of the lowest action point costs, but not super high either, so it works really well in the VATS build. For the general pros of this weapon, it is very easy to find. You can find it all over Old World Blues, even if you're just looking in boxes. You can find it everywhere, so that's really good. It has high damage and it has high damage per second, more so with the other versions we're going to talk about, at least the unique version of this, or modified version of it with the superheated version. The regular version's damage and damage per second is still pretty decent though, and this, at least with the superheated version, does have fire damage, which is a pretty big bonus. We can also kind of go over the Industrial Hand's pros and cons here as well, since we'll might as well talk about that one. It has also pretty good damage per second, okay damage per hit, and it ignores armor and damage threshold, which is a big selling point of it, so that is actually really good. For the major cons of this, the regular Saturnite Fist doesn't really have any cons for a unarmed weapon. Like, it's not very difficult to find, it doesn't break super fast, it's got decent damage per second. The only major con would just be that it gets outcompeted by some of the other unarmed weapons and melee weapons, but not by a substantial amount, so it's still a fairly solid weapon. Cons for the superheated one, you do have to make it, but that's not such a big deal, especially if you plan on 100%ing the game, you're going to be able to do that no problem then. The Industrial Hand, on the other hand, does have more cons though, where it is very, very awkward in VATS. Basically, you never want to use it in VATS. It has a really high action point cost, and you'd have to get through about half of Lonesome Road in order to get it, so all of those are a little bit wonky for it. So the cons here are a little bit weird. Let's also go over the perks, which are also going to seem a little bit strange that affect these weapons. There are some that affect all of them, so let's go over those ones first, and they're the regular melee and unarmed perks that work really well. So we've got Piercing Strike for punching through armor, really good, except for I guess the Industrial Hand, since this still works on it, but it already ignores the damage threshold, so you don't need to worry about that. Purifier, which makes so you do more damage towards mutated enemies like Deathclaw, Super Mutants, Tunnelers, and stuff like that. All really high level enemies that are nice to kill. Slayer, which makes so you can attack faster. This, I think, still affects the Industrial Hand. I'm not entirely sure. I would assume that it does. And then Super Slam, which allows you to knock enemies on the ground. Now, there are some other perks that affect specific ones. Let's talk about those two, at least that I'm going to highlight here. We have Heavyweight, which affects the Industrial Hand. Since the Industrial Hand weighs 10, it can be cut in half down to 5, which is pretty nice. And then we also have Pyromaniac, which makes it so the superheated version of the Saturnite Fist gets even more damage per second and even more damage. Pyromaniac is the highest damage buffing perk in the game. It's just that it only affects a few weapons. The Saturnite Fist Superheated is one of those few weapons, so you actually get a lot of value out of Pyromaniac with this. For an overall rating for the regular Saturnite Fist, I would put this one up into A tier. I think it's solid all the way around. It works really well as an unarmed weapon, but there are some better unarmed weapons that do kind of outcompete it. I think it is just a straight upgrade to a Power Fist though, so that's really nice. Let's move over to the Saturnite Fist Superheated, and we'll talk about that one. This one requires 55 unarmed and 5 strength to wield. Weirdly enough, more strength. That's not usually super common with the unique versions of weapons, but in this case it is. You do have to make these. In order to make these, you do have to get one of the personality mods for the toaster, and then he will make these for you, and you can make an infinite amount of them, assuming that you have the regular fist. So this isn't a unique one-of-a-kind weapon. which does make it actually fairly easy to get, and if you do ever lose it, break it, or just misplace it, you can make another one. It's not a huge deal. This one does 55 damage per hit, 91 damage per second, 55 damage on crit hit. This one has a 1x crit modifier, weighs 4. This one has less item health at 120. This one also costs 25 action points, which can be pretty good. And when it hits crits, it deals 2 damage for 5 seconds with fire on enemies. This also, since it counts as a fire weapon, can be stacked with Pyromaniac, which makes it get a huge amount of damage, and that makes its damage per second go really high. This is probably one of the best unarmed weapons in the entire game because the damage and damage per second is really good. This does attack faster than a regular Power Fist. The extra fire damage on it is kind of nice, but not entirely necessary. The superheated version of this, I'm actually going to put all the way up in S tier. I think it's one of the best unarmed weapons in the game. Since the regular version is so good, and if you have Pyromaniac, this one is even better than it. Now let's move over to the Industrial Hand. Since this one is a completely different weapon and a little bit strange, this is a saw blade onto the fist, and you use it very similar to like the Ripper, the Chainsaw, or the Thermic Lance, and it has the same effect as any of those weapons, which I don't think we've talked about any of them so far in these videos. So we will have to do that in the future. These ones all ignore damage threshold, which is really useful, and damage resistance, so it doesn't matter if your enemy is wearing heavy armor or wearing no armor, it will hit all the same. That is a really big selling point of these weapons, as well as this weapon doesn't punch like a lot of other weapons. It does have the Power Fist animation for punching, but you just hold out your arm and use the saw blade to cut into enemies. This one I think has the shortest reach out of any of those weapons though. I think the Rippers might be the same reach as this or a little bit longer. The Chainsaw and the Thermic Lance have much longer reach than this, and I think are kind of better weapons for this same type of job, but let's go over the stats of this. The Industrial Hand requires 75 unarmed and 7 strength to wield, so fairly high, although it is found in the Lonesome Road, and that's generally like the end game DLC. You can find this right at the part where you're launching the nuke. This one does 50 damage on hit, 160 DPS because it is just like one of the Rippers, you just hold it onto something and you keep dealing damage per second. This has 40 crit damage, which is actually very high for a weapon like that. The Chainsaw, the Thermic Lance, and the Ripper all have very low crits. This one actually has pretty high crits on it. This one has a 1x crit modifier, which is also fairly good for a weapon that hits so often. This costs a massive 65 action points to use in VATS, and like I said earlier, you should never be using the Industrial Hand in VATS. It is very, very bad in VATS. This one weighs 10, so again, you can cut it in half with heavyweight and go down to 5. It is one of the heavier unarmed weapons, and this has 1600 item HP because it breaks so fast since it's hitting so often. So that kind of makes sense. This one I find to be kind of awkward and not as good as like the Thermic Lance or the Chainsaw for doing the same job. I think those are better options where the Chainsaw has more mods that you can put on it, and I think that makes it a bit better, and the Thermic Lance has better reach. The Thermic Lance also has a really good VATS attack. I think the Chainsaw does too. I think they both have Mauler, which is a really, really good VATS attack. The Industrial Hand doesn't really get anything like that, and you don't want to be using this in VATS because it is really janky, so it does make it just a weird choice overall for me. I think I'd put the Industrial Hand into B tier. It is a very strong unarmed weapon, but it's a very awkward unarmed weapon and not one that I find myself using very much. The superheated Saturnite Fist, though, is definitely an S tier and a really, really good weapon. So would I recommend these? Sure, they're all pretty good. Saturnite Fist is good, Superheat is really good, Industrial Hand is okay, but kind of quirky and a little bit weird. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.